What's up, YouTube? Today I'm gonna go through getting this hunk of metal rebuilt. So if you wanted a video that shows you how to build the Dana 20, stay tuned. Let's get to it on Project Brake Horse. So the first go at the Dana 44 was a huge failure, and that's mainly because I've never done this before, and in that process it was beneficial that I failed because now I understand bearings and preloads and shims a lot better. So today we're working on the Dana 20. I didn't see any solid literature or rebuild videos on YouTube, so I was going to try and make this one kind of an insight into what it's going to take to rebuild this. So I have the master kit from Wild Horses, which I'll go through in a second. I've got the whole case apart. All the input and output shafts are torn apart, and then even the housing for the Speedo. All kinds of roller bearings and washers off to the side here, but that all comes in the kit. So let's go ahead and talk about this kit. They threw in the detent ball and spring kit. There's bearings, there's new roller bearings and thrust washers, shims, seals, all kinds of stuff. Now, there's more bearings than there are cones, and I got to thinking about that, and I think what they did was this master kit is for both the, from 66 to 77, there was two types of transfer case, the T shift and the J shift. This is 73, it's a J shift. I've identified what bearings have to go in these shafts, but I believe that it's for both cases. That's why there's two different size small bearings in here. So I'm going to still double check and measure with a caliper, but some of these inner diameters are different, and I believe it's, you know, it services the T shift case as well. For this assembly, I'm going to do a little bit of reverse engineering. I have a exploded diagram of the case. I'll link the diagram, and additionally I found on one of the forums there's a guy who went through and repurposed the service manual from Ford for these transfer cases. So I guess, you know, it just wasn't a modern document, so he went through and typed it back up and got the pictures in here. So this is going to be really helpful. I'll link that as well. So first up, as I said, I have the case all torn apart. I'm going to go ahead and pull out, I have all of the gears cleaned in this box. The SamCam went through and cleaned these up pretty nice for me. Before I even start on the case, I'm going to go ahead and get my whole output shaft assembly finished so that I can just set it aside. Now, as I was saying earlier, there's both Timken and Koyo bearings that came out of this transfer case. I believe that that was a factory Ford mixed with Dana. Dana assembled it to a certain degree and then it gave it to Ford, and then Ford put their final components in it to match up with their transmissions. This whole kit's Koyo, so I'm going to go ahead and call out the bearings and races that are going to go into it and where they go. So on the rear, well, on the front side of this output housing, the first race that's going to go in is the Koyo 25821. I'm going to go ahead and drive that on in there. So we're going to heat this bearing up. I went ahead and drove the race into the bottom of this output housing. First bearing is going to go on, so slide down right on here. Let's get this heated and on there. There it is. Alright, we had our bearing heated, slid that on, and then I went ahead and cleaned off this collar with speedo gear, cleaned that all off, and then put that back on. One thing I tried to make sure is there's knurls on this collar. I wanted to center this speedo gear so when I put it in the housing and I spin it, I can see right through the speedo port that it's lined up, and that'll match perfectly. So now I need to put on this other bearing, and once this is put on, this is going to hold this whole output shaft in this housing. So shim pack, the shims that came out of it are 90 thousandths. The race that's going to go in this output side towards the rear of the car is the Koyo 15245. We'll drive that in, and then the bearing that accompanies that race is 15117. Alright, we're heating up this bearing. Just make sure whenever you do this, you're going to have to put that front one on first, get it in the housing. I've got the shim pack inside that housing down in there, and then you need that bearing to fall down on top. So the race is already in there, and now we're going to go ahead and turn this bearing over and drop it in. The bearing is dropped in there. Now what we need to do is put the seal on here before we go ahead and put the yoke on. Alright, now the seal is driven in. I'm going to go ahead and put that yoke on there. I'm going to put a little bit of gasket maker around the splines. And then my yoke nuts aren't here yet. I'm going to get new ones, but I'm going to put the existing one on for the time being just to button it up and then kind of see what torque's going to do to these bearings. So let's go ahead and get this yoke squared away. Alright, that's on there. Let's go ahead and grab our yoke nut here. Now these are a locking nut, and it didn't come with the kit, but they're 3/4 with 16 threads for the TPI. So they're also a top lock nut. I went out and got a couple of them online because I figured I'm going to have to be messing with this preload. So we're going to just put this on for the time being. And there you have it. Output shaft is reassembled with new bearings. So let's set this off to the side here and start putting the Dana 20 back together. Moving on to the case itself, in these directions that are supplied by Ford. Number one, install the front detent rod in the case. Alright, cleaning the rod off right now. It's going to go in through the second. If I'm looking at the case like this, where these rails go in, one side has one hole, the other side has two. It's going to go in the bottom. So the one that's furthest away from you, depending on how you're looking at it, get a little bit of oil on it. Put this in. Take my screwdriver here. Just make sure I can. You can see it through these two rails. And there, it's just about exposed on each side. So number 2, slide the front drive shaft rail all the way into the case and position a shift fork on the rail as the rail goes into the case. Secure the fork to the rail with the set screw. Okay. Sliding gears. Forks. And rails. So when I did this initially, there was tape on this rail to designate that it was on the right side of me, and that tape's off, but I did have it also written on the rail itself. So when I said right as the reference point, it meant when I was looking at it, on my right hand side was the tag, and it went in the right rail. So my right side's going to go in. Actually, no. Before I do that, it does not have that written, but I have seals that got to go in here. So I'm going to put these seals in. Down means they're fully in. So my seals are in there. I need to then do as it was saying for number 2. Let's place this rod in. Gear oil here. So the difference is going to be, on one side we have 1 valley, and then on the other there's 3. This inside is going to go for that detent rod, and then the balls go outside of it and help it move along inside this. So my right one's going in, past this seal. There we go. I see my detent rod down in there. Not really doing much. So the directions are telling me to install 1 of 2 detent rods. Well, this only came with 1, which I guess some J-shift cases only did come with 1. So now that that's in there, what I want to do is turn this over, and then I need to look in here so that I can get this shift fork on the rod with my set screw, and then also get this sliding gear in place.
You're using proper torque values.
Here's the socket that I was talking about. 3/8 going in on the set screw. Torque specs call for 10 to 18. I'm going 18. When you put these in, what you want to do is make sure that the set screw is towards the shift rail. And then whenever you put these sliding gears back in, whenever you put these sliding gears in, the collar is going to be towards the engine. So the front, where the tag is on the case, that's the front side of these Dana 20s. Alright, a couple things I'd like to point out. First being, the set screws go in the case that you see as such. And then this is my input side, this is my output side. On my input side, since this is still the J-shift case, what came out of it was this main gear over here. So that main gear is going to go back on the input shaft. The high speed gear that's on the output side still is attached to the transmission adapter. So I need to get that apart. There's a snap ring on there, but I'm going to do that once my transmission, I'm getting a 5-speed transmission. I need to see what that adapter looks like before I go and do that. But that gear will just fit right through that housing. I don't need this case open in order to put that in there. So I'm going to get the bearings set up on my input side and then get those pressed with the cones inserted as well, so I can get this input side finished.
Business.
Actually, hold on for a second.
Oh, there you go.
Alright. Now, once I'm going to let that cool before I touch it, but it's going to go in through like such. Install the main drive gear spacer and secure with snap ring. Additionally, I went out and got the diagram that came straight from Dana. So this is a different resource that I was working with. My figure 8 and figure 9 are what I'm working with in this specific setup, since this is for Ford. I already assembled the rear bearing. So now the main drive gear is in as such, and they're saying put in the spacer, then the bearing, then the spacer, and the retainer. So I have those: spacer, old bearing, and spacer. So let me get those cleaned up, put the first one on, and then install this other. Alright, so this spacer actually has kind of an imprint of the splines from that input shaft on it, so it's going to go in. I'm going to put that in the exact same way. Now I'm going to take, so the bearing that came out of it was 14116, identical to the one that I just put on. Here's one of the races that I need, and then verify 14116. So we're going to heat this up, place this on, and then it'll be time to put on our cones. Alright, these so this is the front output shaft rear cover with the shim pack, which the ones that came off of it were 71 thousandths. What do you know, the pack that they gave me is just about the same, so I installed all the new ones. And the bolts that came out of it have blue thread locker on it, so I'm going ahead and just putting some new blue on there. That way hopefully it doesn't leak out of these bolts and the shims. And these get torqued down 25 to 35 foot-pounds. So I'm going to go ahead and get these squared away. Alright, 35 foot-pounds. Looks good. Let's flip this over. And if you remember, I was supposed to install that spacer. Well, there is no clip that came with it, so that fell off. I cleaned it again. Now that's going to go back on. Using the front flange and the tool shown in figure 5, install the front output shaft front bearing on the shaft. Install the front bearing. So the tool that they show is not how we're going to do it. We're going to heat that bearing like we've been doing and just slide it down on there. So let's heat that bearing up. Bearing's in there. We're going to put the race in and then put a seal in the housing cover. From there, put the flange on, and then we'll go to the intermediate shaft. So I'm using the spindle nut adapter, which is perfect so that I can get this race in there. Alright, so now we got to put our seal in. Well, I didn't realize this, but the felt gaskets that come with the kit, there's two of them that were supposed to go in behind these seals that I already drove in. So hopefully by me putting that gasket maker, the anaerobic gasket maker on these splines like I did in the output housing, hopefully that'll keep it from leaking. So I'm just going to have these left over. If it leaks, then I guess I know where my problem's coming from. But now I'll take this gasket will go on here as such, and then I'm going to also throw on a little bit of some oil resistant RTV. It's made for gear oil and any friction modifiers that you put in the oil to help resist it. Alright, 35 foot-pounds on these. Alright, the next step has me taking the needle bearings that go into this output shaft, installing those around in the circle, and then setting this aside to then go install more needle bearings. So up next we're going to do those, and in the process I have that assembly glue that I used in the power steering pump, or I'm sorry, box. So I'm going to go ahead and use that and get these placed in here. Alright, the roller bearings are in with that goo, and I just want to say this stuff's amazing. I mean, I can violently shake it and they don't shift, so highly recommend this stuff. I'm not sponsored though. What I'm going to do now is pack the needle bearings inside this intermediate gear with the same assembly goo. Alright, the roller bearings are in both sides. There's a washer in the middle, then the roller bearings, then an outside washer on both sides. So now the goal is to put this in, down in here with the thrust washers on the outside, and then the intermediate shaft has to go through without losing any of those roller bearings. So the thrust washer has a key on it. It's going to go in this keyway here. So I got to get these in and then figure out how I'm going to drive that intermediate shaft through here without losing any bearings. I'm going to probably end up, I have an old shaft if I want to use it, or I could just use a socket. So here we go. Alright, we have the intermediate shaft in just enough to have the first thrust washer down here in, and then the second one right there, to where if you are able to see inside here, we got all that assembly grease and the two, well, the middle washer and then the two outside washers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the end of my bearing driver, I'm going to put this in and let that intermediate shaft drive this out. So that's touching it. So then that way I have a guide for those bearings as a fail-safe, because that goo is awesome. I wrapped on this to get a bearing out on the back side, and this whole thing fell on the floor and those stayed just where they're supposed to be. So let's go ahead and get this shaft through. I went ahead and put on the O-ring there on the idler shaft, and then changed my approach. We put a socket in there. It was a 13/16 that went inside there. It was a nice guide. That idler shaft's pretty much through. None of that stuff shifted, so that assembly glue is a must if you're going to do this. So we're going to get this finally put in there, put the locking pin in that shaft, and then put on some gaskets and seal it up. Okay, the intermediate shaft is fully installed. I only have the input shaft flange yoke just on there, kind of spin the gears. But now I would need to put in the detent balls and springs. The direction says install the front and rear drive shift rail detent balls, springs, and retaining plugs. Be sure that the heavier loaded spring and flat washer are installed in the front drive shift rail. Looking at these springs, they look nearly identical, but I believe the one on the right is just a little bit more stout. So that's going to go in this side here, because this is the input shaft. So those are going to go, so the ball goes in first, and then the spring, and then my plug. So if that's the case, I'll get some oil on this. Just gotta be careful here. So I got the output shaft below the bench. I'm gonna push that in. My heavier duty spring. Put in said plug. Then I have the additional off to the front here. And then these, I believe, these are supposed to be flush to 20 thousandths of an inch below the case surface. There's not really a torque set on these, so these are more of like a set screw. So I'm going to go to flush, but then I have the other side here. I got to put this ball and spring in before I put that plug in, and then really that's it. Like I said, I have a few gaskets to put on, but some of that can't be done until I can't put those in until I get the adapter for the transmission. Alright, we got most of the transfer case together last night. I put these shift rails in with their respective detent balls and springs. Now what I'm looking to do, I want to go ahead and torque down these bolts. After that, I need to take the input shaft and put on this flange for the yoke. Seal is in there, but I'm going to have to put sealant on this and get this in there, torque down, check my preload, and that was the other one. I got to check my preloads once again before I finally put these in. It's rated in between 0 and 10. I mean, it's kind of hard to narrow down exactly where it's at, but this was calling for anywhere from 3 to 7 or 4 to 7, so I'm a little on the high side on 7. I'm going to go ahead and say that that's good. So the output shaft, that's doing great. Let's turn this around and get this flange on here. I got the output shaft all squared away. I tightened down that flange bolt to 125, and this feels great. It's about 5 foot-pound or inch-pounds. Now I need to go ahead and take my input shaft and put it on here. So this goes on. I'm going to put some sealer on it, put this on, get the nut to hold it in for the time being, and there's an O-ring that goes inside it. It talked about a new O-ring. Doesn't fit like the old one does, so I'm going to use the old one. The old one's in good shape, and then the washer goes over that, and then the nut. So I'm going to get the sealant on this place this in here and then check the preload. Alright, I got this torqued down to 125. Checking the preload on it instead of the end plate as the directions call for. And that way is like 3 or 4. Right there's 5. So I'm pretty sure that this one's set perfectly. I got the whole shim pack that was provided in here. So I have the old shim pack too. I'm going to tighten up these drain plugs, and that should be it. The only other thing would be to put this this cover back on, which is really, you pull this off, the inspection cover. I might hold off on that though, because I got to put the input shaft from the transmission in this side. So once I tighten these and Loctite the drain plugs, I mean, that's pretty much it. And then I would go ahead and I could put that adapter on there, pour oil from this side, and then it's finished. I button it up. So so this is the drain plug with the square in it. This torque is 20 to 30 foot-pounds, and the filler plug's 10 to 20. So I'm going to go 30 on this, get these torques, and then set this aside, put it on the shelf so that I can move on to the next piece.